marching home again, hurrah, hurrah.
Now that we've finished the Civil War, it's time for us to look at Reconstruction. Reconstruction is that time period after the Civil War where the country is put back together. The accepted years for the beginning and end of it starts in 1865 with the end of the Civil War, and it ends in 1877 as a result of a presidential election. So we'll cover that later, how that came to be. But so it was 12 years where the United States tries to repair itself and put itself back together after the damage and destruction of the Civil War. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to go back and look at what Abraham Lincoln said peace would look like. And one of the things that we talked about during the Civil War was the idea of winning the war sometimes is the easy part, that winning the peace is the more difficult part, actually accomplishing the goals that you started out with for the conflict. And I said last week, hopefully we're not a nation of sociopaths where we just enjoy killing people and breaking stuff, that there's a goal at the end of that. What do we want to see different as a result of this death and destruction? So remember, there was a process to that Lincoln at the beginning of the war said that this was strictly about reunion, just putting the country back together. The South was illegal in their actions, that they could not break away and form their own country. And that was also when he thought the war would be over rather quickly. Remember, his first call was for 90-day volunteers, 90 days. So they all thought that they would have this wrapped up by the end of that first war. But remember then, as the war gets more terrible, as the North is looking for reasons to keep fighting, as they're looking at ways to keep foreign intervention out, and as Lincoln, as a Republican, is interested in getting rid of slavery, the decision is made after the Battle of Antietam to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, adding slavery as getting rid of slavery as one of the goals for the war. That is now on the to-do list. Now, remember, the Emancipation Proclamation actually freed nobody at that time, but it was important because Lincoln is announcing with it, when this is over and the North wins, slavery will be gone. So you can't downplay the importance of that in history. And then the third goal that Lincoln adds for the war, and the most complicated one by far, is that idea of working towards equality. And we looked at that, and remember how we looked at the Gettysburg Address and what he said the country was fighting for with the Gettysburg Address. So what we need to do now is break this down and look and see how many of those goals are actually accomplished. And something else that complicates this, something else that you need to remember, is that Abraham Lincoln's not a dictator. Just because he announced that this was a war aim, that's something that we as a country were fighting for, doesn't mean that every person, white, black, North, South, are going to be in lockstep agreement with what he said this war was about. And that's going to make those goals much more complicated in terms of whether or not we are successful, because some people are going to be openly fighting against trying and accomplish some of those goals. All right, some other things that we need to look back and remember before we move forward deeper into Reconstruction. One thing that I want to point out is what we talked about with Lincoln's re-election chances in 1864. Remember, throughout 1864, Grant is going at Lee, and militarily that makes sense. He's beating the crap out of him, but that is making the war unpopular back home. The casualty lists keep getting longer and longer. So by the summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln is convinced that he will not be reelected president. He just knows for a fact that he is going to lose the election of 1864. And because of that, he's looking for anything that he can possibly do to help his reelection chances. And so one of the things that he hits upon is changing who his vice presidential nominee is. His first term presidential or vice president is Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. And honestly, Hannibal Hamlin doesn't do anything to help Abraham Lincoln get reelected. The first week of school, we talked about how the vice president really doesn't do much of anything, that their only official power is to break ties in the Senate. So most vice presidents serve their entire term without ever actually doing anything officially. And so the decision is made that the Republicans are going to run a rather unconventional person as the vice presidential nominee for Abraham Lincoln in 1864, anything that might get some extra votes to come his way. And that's usually what's one of the driving forces when people pick their vice presidential nominee is, where's this person from? Will they bring me votes from a certain region or from a certain type of voter? And so the decision is made to put Andrew Johnson up as the nominee for vice president. Andrew Johnson is a Southern Democrat. He is a Democrat from Tennessee. He's the only member of Congress from one of the 11 states that joined the Confederacy that refuses to go south, that refuses to quit his job in the United States Congress. He stays in his position in the United States Senate because he feels that secession is illegal and that his fellow Southern countrymen are doing nothing more than breaking the law. And so that's the kind of person that the Republicans want to have on the ticket, and hopefully to get other like-minded Democrats to vote for Lincoln to go ahead and see this war through to its finish. So they pick Andrew Johnson, Southern Democrat from Tennessee, and nobody thinks that that's going to matter, because Lincoln's a healthy guy. Even after he's shot, just as a reminder, he doesn't die immediately, and the doctors are impressed when they actually look to examine him how physically fit Abraham Lincoln is. So nobody's thinking when he's up for re-election in 1864 that it's going to be anything than a full 4-year term. So you pick anybody for vice president, that doesn't matter. That person's never going to have any power. No president had ever been assassinated to that point. Lincoln is the first president assassinated, so that's not part of the equation. Nobody's thinking about that either. So why not pick Andrew Johnson? Why not pick this rather unconventional vice presidential nominee? Because maybe he can help win some votes and maybe Lincoln can eke out a victory. Now remember, the whole equation changes right before the election when Sherman captures Atlanta and people start to see the end of the war is at hand, and then Lincoln ends up winning handily. But by the time that is all discovered, Johnson is the nominee. Of course, John Wilkes Booth changes that whole line of thinking with his assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So Andrew Johnson goes from being what would have been an irrelevant footnote in history, just like Hannibal Hamlin, because who remembers Hannibal Hamlin, to president of the United States. That's the tricky thing about being vice president. You have no power, no influence as vice president, and then you're one heartbeat away from being commander-in-chief, the most powerful person in America. And so Andrew Johnson goes through that. He goes from being completely irrelevant to the person. So we need to know a little bit more about Andrew Johnson and how he figures into this. Johnson is opposed to secession, but that doesn't necessarily make him a Republican where he's interested in really getting rid of slavery or working towards any kind of racial equality. Johnson is a tailor by trade. He is not a member of what you call the slaveocracy, what they call the slaveocracy, the rich plantation-owning slave owners that were the driving force behind secession. The Jefferson Davis was a member of the slaveocracy. Huge plantation owner, owned hundreds of slaves. Andrew Johnson hates those kinds of people because they hated him. They, to use the terminology that they would have used at that time, they would have looked down their nose at Andrew Johnson as poor white trash. And he decides that he's going to look right down his nose back at them. And so he is opposed to Southern secession, not because he's some sort of believer in racial equality, but because he wants to punish people like Jefferson Davis, who he holds responsible for causing the war. And that person is now president of the United States. Now, remember, that's going to matter here because Lincoln had talked about, that this war was to get rid of slavery and to try and create racial equality. We need to understand Andrew Johnson's not interested in that. He is a white supremacist. Just because he was opposed to the slaveocracy does not mean that he was a believer in racial equality. He wants Southern whites to stay in power and for there definitely to be multiple social classes there, whites on top and blacks on bottom. That's the way he wants the world in the South. And becoming president of the United States is not going to change that. The other thing that kind of occurs with Andrew Johnson that we need to keep in mind, some stuff that I've read about him is that Johnson goes through this weird kind of mental conversion here too. He comes into the war again feeling like the slaveocracy looks down their nose at him. But then when he's president, a lot of those same rich plantation owners have to start coming to him and begging for pardons from him. And it's the best analogy that I can make is that, and you've probably seen movies like this where they're set in high school and there's some kid who's kind of an outsider, does not run with the popular kids or whatever. And something happens and there's a plot twist where suddenly that kid is big man on campus and everybody knows them and, they're suddenly very popular and they forget all of their real friends. There's been a million movies made with that as the plot line. And I hate to boil this down to something like that, but that's essentially what happens to Andrew Johnson from everything I've read. He goes from feeling like he's not one of those members of the slaveocracy that he's, they look down at him to suddenly now he's one of them, that those people have had to come to him and beg for pardons. So he goes through this weird mental gymnastics where he's on their side now. And he remembers in his heart of hearts that he is a white supremacist that really doesn't want to change much about the South. And that person is now president of the United States through some weird quirks. Again, his selection for very political reasons to help Lincoln win the election, and then the actions of John Wilkes Booth puts a Southern white supremacist in the White House within 5 days of the end of most of the fighting in the Civil War. Now, why does that matter? Well, the president obviously is very, very important, but something else you need to keep in mind here is nobody knows who's going to be in charge of Reconstruction. You read the Constitution, there's nothing in there about Reconstruction. No, they didn't, when they wrote the Constitution, nobody's saying, well, what are we going to do when this whole thing comes flying apart? We better put something in here about rebuilding the country after it's destroyed. So the question of who's in charge of Reconstruction is one that they're going to have to try and answer on the fly. And the short answer to that question, who's in charge of Reconstruction, at the beginning is a really simple one to answer, and it's going to be the president. It's the executive branch that takes charge of this at the beginning because, quite literally, the legislative branch is not meeting at that time. Congress is much different now than what it was 150, 200 years ago. Congress used to only come together for a short period every year and pass laws and do whatever they needed to do. And then everybody would go back home and go back to their regular job. Well, that's not what you do in Congress today. If you're a member of Congress today, that is your job. You're there more than you're not. So Congress is in session much more commonly than what they were in 1865. Congress is not due to come back into session until December of 1865. So who's in charge of Reconstruction? The president, because he's there all the time. He's always the president. He doesn't have to meet with anybody else to be the president. Congress is only Congress when they actually come together. So for the first 6-8 months of Reconstruction, it's all going to be under the direction of the President of the United States, which is Abraham Lincoln for about a week, and then Andrew Johnson through the summer and early into the fall of 1865.
Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah.
Right, as we look at Reconstruction, there's going to be two recurrent themes that I'm going to come back to. One is who's in charge of this, who runs this show. And the second theme that I'm going to come back to over and over again is here's what they said they were going to do, but here's what actually happened. The plan versus the reality. So we're going to look at both the plans and the reality. First, we're going to start with the plans. And there are 3 plans for Reconstruction that we need to look at. Why 3? Well, one is, remember, nobody knows who's in charge. So we're going to look at some presidential plans versus a congressional plan for Reconstruction. And we also need to understand that there are 2 different presidential plans for Reconstruction because Lincoln's plan is essentially going to die with him, and it's going to be replaced by the desires of Andrew Johnson, and then ultimately that's going to be superseded or taken over by what Congress wants. So really quickly, let's just look down the list here. In general, what are they after? Lincoln's plan is really not very well developed. We don't really know where he was going to go with this. And it's really one of those sad what might have been stories too, what Lincoln might have been able to get accomplished versus Andrew Johnson. Lincoln's overall strategy was going to be one of forgiveness. That his mindset really was that the country had bled for 4+ years, and it was time to move on from that. Let's let bygones be bygones. Enough punishment and blood has been meted out as a country. Let's come back together and move on. His plan is known as the 10% plan, and that's what it boiled down to. If 10% of registered voters in the seceded states swore allegiance to the Union, under Lincoln's plan, they could resume their position in the states that they were, if they voided secession and said that they were back in the country, they were back in the country. And it didn't take a majority, it didn't take all of them, it took 10%. And because his mindset was once they're back in the fold, he actually, in one of his speeches, talked about the mystic chords of memory, that once people were back in the mix, that once they were once again under that U.S. flag, that those feelings of patriotism would sweep over them and they would come back into the country. And Lincoln wanted to accept them with open arms. Again, we don't know how far he would have been able to go with this, or how accepting others, including Congress, might have been with this. This is kind of a harsh thing to say, but it's also true, I believe. In terms of the way we look at Lincoln historically, his death did him a favor. Now, obviously, he didn't want to die. Don't get me wrong. That's not what that's about. But the way we look at Lincoln is he's this successful president that sees us through this trial by fire that is the Civil War. And then right when it's over and the good guys win, he exits stage right. That's time for him to leave the story here. And I truly believe that any president that would have had to deal with the fallout, that winning the peace here was going to be so much more difficult them winning the war, that we would not look at him the same way if he would have had to try and deal with Reconstruction and all the different things that people wanted to accomplish with that, and just the huge number of different directions that people want to go with this and trying to put it back together. We wouldn't have looked at any president that had to try and go through that fondly. And so Lincoln's historical reputation is protected in a weird way by his death. Johnson, who replaces him, at first talks about punishing the slavocracy, those Southern leaders that he holds responsible for causing this whole thing. But as I mentioned earlier, he does kind of go through this mental flip where he becomes more one of them because his white supremacy side wins out. That heart of hearts that he's a racist that wants other Southern whites to retain their position of power. At first, he wanted it to be guys like him, the ones that were not the rich plantation owners. But at the end of the day, what he wants is a return to Southern whites in power in the South. And so his plan is going to be ultra forgiving. The third plan, the radical or the congressional plan, it's called the Radicals plan because Republicans owned both houses of Congress at that time. And, it's either congressional Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction. These are the people that see slavery as a great moral wrong that must be rectified, that the South must be on some level rebuilt and punished, and that it needs to be completely altered in terms of its political, social, and economic makeup. And so that third plan is the one that's going to be much more, not just radical because that was their name, but radical in terms of bringing about change to the South, and radical also in our political spectrum definition, where you're going to have a lot of government necessary to bring about those changes. Okay, so those are the three big ideas, three big plans. So let's again talk about what actually happened with this. Again, Lincoln's plan dies with him. What that might have looked like and what Reconstruction, what form that might have taken under Lincoln, we'll never know. Johnson's Reconstruction is incredibly short. He claims by December of 1865 that Reconstruction's over, that it's like the Civil War has never been fought, and that Southern states are re-electing or electing members of Congress that are ready to come back and resume their seats. Many of the same guys that had led the charge to secession, many of the guys that were members of the Confederate Congress are elected to the U.S. Congress, and Johnson's ready to let them come back in as if the Civil War had never happened. I mean, think about what is happening here. The president is a Southern white supremacist Democrat, and there are members of that party that identifies with slavery that are ready to come back into the United States Congress by the end of 1865. Within a year of the war being over, they're ready to act like it never happened. Who in the hell won? If that's what's happening, who won the war? That you've got a Southerner white supremacist in the White House, and Southerners are ready to come back and resume their positions in Congress. What just happened for 4 years? And so, not surprisingly, when Congress comes back into session, those that were there, the Northern representatives, are not ready to seat these Southern members, the ones that had been causing the war for 4 years. They are going to call BS on this whole thing and hit the reset button on all of Reconstruction. And that is going to set up a showdown between President Johnson and Congress over who's in charge. And that's going to head towards Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Now, he is not going to be removed from office. He is impeached. That's step one of the two-step process of removing the president from office, as we have seen within the last year. It's a two-step process. Impeachment of the president does not take them out of office. In this case, though, Johnson is politically destroyed by that, because one of the things you have to think about is who's really on Andrew Johnson's side here. Who does he count as a friend politically? Well, it's definitely not the Republicans in Congress. He's not one of them with what his line of thinking is. And to many Democrats, he's a sellout that ran with the ultimate Republican, Abraham Lincoln. And so most Democrats don't see him as a friend, and Republicans don't accept him as a Republican because he's not. And so Johnson really has no real supporters in the national government. And so Congress is going to take over Reconstruction by the end of 1865. They're going to undo everything that Johnson says has been done. The reset button is going to be pressed on the whole process of Reconstruction. And what we're going to look at for the next 10 or 12 years then is going to be that congressional Reconstruction.
Welcome then, hurrah, hurrah, the men will feel in the ball for